Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
Last episode, we had the delight of having Paul Burberry on the show. And for a brief time in there, we spoke a bit about DieSync EDM, just a little tangent off of Wire EDM. And for whatever reason, that got my gears spinning. It led me to realize that it is very probable that is how Dufour has achieved those phenomenally sharp corners on the engraving on their watch movements and dials. This is a combination. I would imagine if I were to do it using that technology, I would CNC out my original or preliminary die, so to speak, sink that in to a piece of steel, and then go in with the CNC mill again and take off all the corners I couldn't get to properly with the radiuses on my tooling, and then use that to sync the final impression, or if that's not the impression I wanted, sync that into a tool that is then used to do the final impression, but going through a multi-step process like that in order to get those really sharp interior and exterior angles combined.
I don't know what Dufour is doing for their work, but you can certainly do some incredible, detailed, sharp-cornered work with a DieSync EDM. Again, we spoke last episode about Mike Walker, knife maker down in Taos, New Mexico, does some unbelievable work. And I spoke about his Wire EDM work, where he was creating interlocking dovetail sort of zipper patterns with the Wire EDM out of two different materials, two different metals, and then putting them together. And that is impressive what he was doing with it. But he's also done some very impressive DieSync EDM work as well on his knives, where he has gone off and sunk, sharp cornered patterns into the scales of his knives and things like that, and then done inlay in there. Also, Rich Littleston, we've spoken about many episodes ago. He's a pen maker that I know out of Denver, Colorado. And again, he's done similar things where he's done silver tubed pens where he's used a DieSync EDM to cut very sharp cornered patterns into the silver, and then gone and inlaid mother of pearl into those patterns. And that mother of pearl was cut out on his pantograph. And so he could then match it up perfectly, get the exact pattern that he wanted from the pantograph, and then inlay the mother of pearl into the tube of the pen, which he has cut perfectly using the DieSync EDM. And then he just goes off and sands the mother of pearl to the correct radius so that it is all smooth and perfect and looks great. There are some people doing some really amazing things with EDM technology of all kinds. And it would not surprise me at all. I'm sure that the guys at Dufour are aware of this technology, and it's very possible that's how they're going about doing it.
Yeah, we had first chatted about this all the way back in episode 35.
Yeah.
Which was an SIHH episode. And it's just amazing to me how things like this just sort of background thread for months, years. And then all of a sudden, the pieces click together and you realize, oh, that's how you could do that.
And with so many of these technologies, it really comes down to how much time and effort you want to put into doing them. Something like this, any kind of sinker technology like that is not going to be something you're going to do in mass production. Rolex is not going to just start using DieSync EDM work for manufacturing their cases, for instance. When you're making somewhere around 1 million pieces a year, you can't afford to do that kind of work. They probably use DieSync EDM work for doing either the dies or the stamps for some of their presses. That's a very common way of making dies for very large presses, which is what they're using for some of their case making. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if they are using the technology, but they're not going to be using it straight into their cases. Dufour, they're not making anywhere near 1 million pieces a year. And so you can then start using some of these technologies in ways which is just impractical at volume. It opens up some possibilities that you just don't have any other way.
Yeah, it actually got me thinking a little bit there too. If they're going to go to the extent of using a DieSync EDM to put this engraving into the top of the bridge. And some of these bridges, it's just all engraving. And actually, it's not engraving is almost the wrong word. It's a reverse engraving where all the numbers and the letters are raised away from the metal. So you're not actually cutting the numbers into the metal. You're actually cutting out all the metal around them and going down into the metal. But if you're going to go to the extent of doing that, and you have this high level of polish on your sink already, you could actually have all of your chamfers pre-done, and you could die sink your chamfers and your engraving and all this in just one fell swoop.
Yeah, it opens up some interesting possibilities. In an ideal world, I would have both a wire EDM and a die sink EDM in my studio right now so that I could sit there and experiment with it. It's not that, I wouldn't be able to put it to enough use to be able to justify buying a new one. Buying a used one, though, maybe. It's certainly in that realm of, being able to justify the cost of it for even the small amount of work that it would do. Everything from blanking out parts to cutting pattern bars to, sinking cool patterns into watch cases or bridges or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. There's certainly some possibilities there. As Paul said, you can, obviously cut out all of your bridges out of a big sheet of metal and come back the next day and it's all there. Or if you want to, you can use a very thick piece of metal, say something that's 5 or 6 inches thick, and cut out a bridge from that 5 or 6, 5-inch piece of metal, and then come and take it the next day and just start slicing off all of your parts, right? And you can slice off the parts so that they're exactly the correct thickness. And now in that one pass, you've done the profile of your complex part, and then you can sit there and you can slice off your, 100, 200 parts or whatever it is that you can get out of that 5-inch piece of metal. There are some interesting things that you can do with it if you want to play around with it and sort of learn how to leverage the technology to do what it does.
Yeah, slice bread for watch bridges.
Yeah, exactly. You can do, just slice it to whatever thickness you want. And it's like, this bridge needs to be a little bit thicker than that one, or a little bit thinner. Just slice it the way that it goes.
You mentioned Rich Littleston using a pantograph there to carve out the mother of pearl that he was inlaying into the die sink EDM work that he was doing for his pens. You sent along a link recently for another interesting application of using a pantograph.
As we've been discussing case making, I've been thinking about ways of being able to form those cases and shape them and do the things that I need to do. And obviously CNC machining is an obvious way of doing some of it. But I don't really have a great setup for CNC machining 316L stainless steel, which is probably what my first cases are going to be made out of. And so I've been looking at alternatives, ways that I can get around needing that. And there are some options that we're going to talk a bit about that allow you to, to do things like forming the lugs and cutting the shapes in between those lugs. But some of them are better than others, and some of them are not ideal. One of the things that has come across my radar and something that I've thought about a couple of times in the past is using a pantograph for cutting out the profile of the case. And I saw an Instagram post by DM Tiffany Timepieces, and he had a great post where he was showing how he uses his lathe to cut the profile of the case in a complete circle. And then after he's done cutting all of the circular features on it, he then takes that part over to his pantograph, and he's actually cutting out all of the lugs and everything like that, the space between the lugs, getting all that shape right, taking away the material from the side of the case where he doesn't actually want the lug. And he's got a great post on Instagram, which we'll link to, and showing exactly how he goes about doing that. And I thought it was a perfect example of how you can use a pantograph, pre-CNC technology, to be able to create an accurate and good-looking watch case without needing complex machinery to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we give some perspective to just how low budget or how rudimentary this can be. The blank or the overscale model that he was using to carve out the case using the pantograph was all constructed of wood. So you can just literally just take a piece of wood to a bandsaw or a scroll saw, get the form that you want dialed in, take a bit of sandpaper to it to take off those rough edges so it doesn't get picked up by the feeler that you're using with the pantograph. And then you just transfer that entire shape over to a block of steel.
Yeah, and I think he was using resin to impregnating the edges of it with resin in order to make it a bit harder so that it can wear and last a little bit longer. And I think he ended up doing a 5-to-1 scale model of it. So, it's not a massive model. It's not, it's not something huge, but it's just enough that he can not worry about a lot of the inconsistencies that he's going to get, because even if you're going to cut that original model by hand, you are going to have some, obviously some little inconsistencies in it. And as you say, you can take a file, you can take some sandpaper and clean it up, but it only matters so much. If you've got a very small flaw in that pattern at 5 times size, when the pantograph reduces it down, it's reducing those errors down as well. And so the errors are meaningless when you reduce them down. They're things that you're going to have to clean up anyways, because you're still going to have tooling marks from the pantograph, right? It's still a spinning cutter. It's operating very, very much like a mill is, where it's got a spinning cutter and you're milling out that space. And so you're going to have to clean up those tool marks anyways. All the little flaws that you're going to get in the part after that 5-to-1 reduction, they're meaningless, right? You're going to have to clean them up anyways. So it's actually a very effective way of doing it. Again, if you don't make a million watches like this, but making 10, 25, 50 watches a year, this is a very, very plausible way of doing it. People are giving away pantographs these days because nobody wants them in their shop, right? You can buy, a Haas CNC mill for your shop for, $30,000-$40,000, and it can be running 20 hours a day, making you money. You're not going to use that space to have a couple of pantographs where you have to have a skilled operator standing there operating it manually to be able to do that work. If any work that you would have done with a pantograph, you're going to do with a CNC mill now. But for people like me, people like DM Tiffany timepieces, we're not going to, we can't justify having tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of CNC equipment around to begin with. And so this is a plausible way for us to do that mass production and get the shapes that we want, which are relatively complex and difficult to do well by hand.
Yeah, the most challenging part of making a watch case, or one of, there are a lot of challenging things and tolerances that you absolutely have to get right, particularly if you're going to make a case that's watertight. But one of the more challenging aspects to machine is that area between the lugs. And it is because of those corners. I mean, you are, the one downside to using a process like this is how small can you get that radius in that corner.
Yes.
And you're going to be having to use a fairly tiny cutter to get that to an acceptable range for what we're accustomed to seeing in watch cases. And you're certainly not going to want to cut out the entire case using that size of a cutter, because you're going to either go through a large number of cutters, or it's just, frankly, it's going to take you forever to do.
You don't want to use a tiny end mill like that to cut out the entire space that you need to cut out. However, one of the advantages with the pantograph is that you can first off easily switch out cutters so that you can go from a larger, let's say a 1/4-inch cutter down to a 1/8 cutter down to, a 10th thou cutter. And what you do is you size the stylus on, that you're using to trace the model so that it's the same ratio larger as the pattern is. So if you're using a 1/4-inch cutter, then you go off and use a
1 1/4. If you're going 5-to-1.
Exactly. If it's a 5-to-1, it's 5 times larger, right? And then you go down to the 1/8, the 1/8 size. Well, now you're going to make a stylus that's 5 times that particular cutter. You go down to a 10th thou cutter. Again, the same thing. And every time you go down, you don't have to mill out that entire area, right? One of the nice things with this is that you can see exactly the areas that you need to mill out. You can gently go and sort of approach them and And not only are you getting that 5-to-1 reduction in the pattern, but all of that motion that you're doing is all being reduced as well, and you're getting the mechanical advantage. So it's nice and rigid as you're moving it, and so it actually is quite effective. You can go down and scale in size down to the size of cutter that you need to then get that particular inside corner radius. Because as you say, that is a complex shape that you're getting. You're going from the flat side of the lug to the curved side of the case, and that's a challenging transition to make. And frankly, I don't know that you'd really want to have it a sharp corner in there anyways in a lot of cases, because depending on how you've made that, you could end up with weird stresses in there. With one of the designs that I'm using, it's not too bad because I'm soldering those lugs in place, and so I don't have the weird stresses in there that you would get if you were trying to machine it out of a solid block of metal. But in a lot of cases, like in this, where you've got a single piece of metal, you do want to be careful about making that too sharp a corner. Otherwise, you could run into problems with it.
You mentioned Rolex earlier and how they press out the ingots or the blanks for their cases, and they do indeed press those out. They have a tool and die setup for that. But even though they are using that sort of setup and they could have the sharpest corners they wanted, they do indeed leave a bit of a radius there in transition. Yep. And the one part of that is to account for those stress factors. And the other part too is your piece that's going to be meshing in there. You don't want that to have sharp corners on it either. So you want that to be able to have a roundedness to those corners. Now it's very slight, but you still want that little bit of rounding, so that's not going to get caught on a shirt sleeve or a piece of clothing or dig into someone's arm.
And that's something that we'll talk a little bit more about the progress that we're making on our own watch, but this is something that I've thought about for the watch case that we're looking at making for Project Minotaur watches, using a pantograph for doing this kind of work. And it's one of the options that we have for doing this kind of thing.
Now, given your experience using the pantograph, just how tight of a radius do you think you could actually get in there? Like how small of an end mill do you think you could?
Well, I can buy end mills that are, let's see here, what's the smallest end mill that I've had? 5 thou diameter? Now, that might not work very well in stainless steel.
I was going to say.
We'll have to try it out. Yeah, we can give it a try. The reality is that how small of a radius do you really need in there, right? Like a 1 mil cutter, that's going to give you a 0.5 mil radius in there. That's still a pretty tight radius in there. And a 1 mil cutter is totally reasonable like that. A 1 mil end mill is still a very reasonable thing, and it's going to be reasonably sturdy. Again, you're not going to hog out a huge amount of material with it, but we can start with a larger end mill and then work our way down to that, and eventually go to a 2 mil end mill and then go to a 1 mil end mill, and that gives you that 0.5 mil radius in there. So, yeah, I think that a 0.5 mil radius is probably going to look quite good.
As you mentioned, like another way to approach this challenging machining task, and it is challenging because you do have that arc and that flat edge. If it was flat edge to flat edge, it's trivial.
That's easy. Yeah, it's trivial
got
to do.
No issue at all. But it's that arc introduces some issues. But you can get specialized cutters for this sort of task. Or, as we've alluded to, you could use a wire EDM.
Sure.
You could take the sliced bread approach and actually have a 5-inch chunk of steel that you've wire EDM'd to have the exact lug profile that you want to have, and then slice off the bits and do the rest on a lathe. But there are specialized cutters that are designed specifically for this task. You can actually get a cutter made out of tungsten carbide that will go in, and its sole purpose in life is to cut out that space between the lugs.
Yeah, there are custom tooling companies out there. One of the ones that we've seen an example of was from AB Tool. They're out on the west coast of the U.S., I think. And they made this custom end mill for hogging out the material in between the lugs and getting that case profile exactly where it needs to be. And looking at the size of this cutter and the big chunk of carbide that's there, I can tell you, having purchased a lot of carbide, that is not a cheap cutter. just in the amount of carbide that's there, it's not inexpensive. And then also the crazy geometry that had to be machined into that is not going to be an inexpensive cutter. And the other disadvantage of this is, while this is great, again, if you're going to be producing thousands of cases, The big disadvantage with this is that you're then stuck with that exact profile. You don't have a choice in what your profile is going to be unless you want to spend hundreds of dollars on another one. So in my case, I'm working on a 42 mil case and a 38 millimeter case for my first watch. If I wanted to use something like this, I would have to have 2 cutters made for that. If at some point I decide, hey, let's make a 36 mil case, now I have to shell out for another end mill. The advantage of something like the pantograph is that I don't have to do that. All I need to do is produce a new template to work from. That's a couple of dollars in material. In my case, I can use Rich's big CNC router to cut it out. And I've got myself a perfectly serviceable template for a few dollars. And yes, it's a little bit more time consuming and a little bit more labor intensive to actually cut out the case. It means that I don't have to spend hundreds of dollars on a custom cutter to be able to do it. But this is certainly a great advantage if you're trying to produce, let's say hundreds or thousands of cases a year, which are going to be the same or have that same profile. Then this is totally a plausible way of doing it. It would certainly be a good investment if you're trying to do that.
Mm-hmm. And the approach that you are taking with these cases as well, at least as far as I understand, the latest prototype, you don't even need to bother with the pantograph.
Yeah.
Because you're actually doing the lugs as a completely separate piece. Then you're able to solder those in because these cases are being made from precious metals like silver and palladium.
Yeah. Yeah. In my case, I've been able to avoid some of these problems. However, I do also want to be able to make some of these cases out of 316L. I want to be able to make them out of stainless Damascus. I want to have the option to machine them out of harder materials, which are not something I can cast easily. We've talked about the fact that I can get 316L cast for me into the lug shape that I want, or maybe even the entire case shape that I want, but I can't get Damascus done like that. So Chris Plouffe is doing really great stainless steel Damascus. He can get me the blanks that I need in terms of the sheet material, which I can cut out, but I can't cast that. You're not going to get a Damascus pattern out of a cast material. So there are limits to what you can do with some of this in the other techniques that I've been trying to apply to the case design. And so every time you make a change, whether it's a material change or whether it's a shape change or a process change, available tooling, you've got limitations that you have to work with. And those restrictions are what makes this job interesting, right? You have to sort of work around them and figure out, how is this going to work? How am I going to effectively machine this? And something that will work fine for, a 316 case, straight 316, I can buy a rod, a 2.5 inch diameter rod of 316 steel and just start turning parts off of it. I can't do that with Damascus steel. I'm going to get a very different raw material from Chris than I can get from, McMaster Carr with with a bar of stainless. And the same thing, I can't buy a 2.5 inch diameter bar of palladium 500, right? Even if I couldn't afford it, right? I'd be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of metal sitting there, right? So I have to take a different approach when I use that particular material. That's that's sort of what makes this job interesting. All of these things provide little challenges, and you have to figure out what the best way is of approaching certain things.
And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from CNC and wire EDM, you can just go full out old school and use something like the Bühler case making lathe that we chatted about with Christian Lass a few months back. We are very pleased to say that Christian has unveiled the final prototype that he was busy in the throes of working on back when we chatted to him.
Yeah, he revealed that on Instagram a couple of days ago, and it looked great. The case is interesting, and again, he's using these old school case making lathes, which take advantage of CAM technology and multi-tool setups using a rotary tool set up on the tailstock, and they're fascinating machines. And again, these are sort of the industrialization pre-CNC for making large numbers of cases. And this case that he's got, it looks great. The watch looked great. And of course, a big part of that is the incredible engraving that that Hani, his wife, has done on the dial and on the case and on the movement. She's done a spectacular job of hand engraving the lettering and the numbers that are on there. Great to see this watch at a stage where he's willing to show it off and show it to the world, because it looks really nice. It's nice and clean. It's not a complex design, and it looks really, really good.
Yeah, Hannah did a really charming job on that engraving work on the dial, and yeah, I'm just so impressed with her handiwork there.
Yeah, I've spoken a little bit off air about some of this. I'm not impressed with a lot of the hand engraving that's been done out there for dial work, especially with numbers and letters. It's really tough to do that well, and getting it absolutely bang on is really, really difficult.
Yeah, her talent and years of experience truly shine through on this piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the only ones that, let's say, are in the same ballpark at all to me are some of the pieces from, let's say, George Daniels and some of the engraving done on Dufour's pieces. Like, this is just some really next level hand engraving that she's done here. And of course, the old school Breguet timepieces, the engraving there, again, he was the reigning king for a reason, as sort of the high priest of high horology. Mm-hmm. Speaking of George Daniels and Breguet, your wife has brought, of all people, has brought to our attention that a particular book is coming back into print.
Well, you say of all people, but the problem is this poor woman, every year, my birthday and Christmas are very close together, and this poor woman is always trying to find something to buy me as a gift, because, of course, I'm a horrible person to buy for. First off, if I see something that I like, I just buy it. And I don't wait for birthdays and stuff like that. And then I've got really weird tastes and interests and things like that. So she's always looking for things that are good to buy for me for Christmas. And so she was, going around and looking for copies of The Art of Breguet by George Daniels. She knows that I've been looking for a copy of it, and so she was trying to find one for me potentially for Christmas. And she found out that they're actually republishing it. Now, don't get your hopes up too high. They say that it's going to be published in May of 21. Daniel's books have not been well known for being published on a good timeline. I mean, unless, 4 years late is a good timeline. So I wouldn't hold my breath and expect it to actually be released in May of 21. But the nice thing is that it looks like there's going to be a reprint of that book, which is amazing to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's consoling to know that there is at least something in the pipeline.
Yeah.
Because it's wild, the trajectory and the prices for these books. I mean, the same thing happened with watchmaking before the fourth edition came out. And I'm fortunate enough to already own a copy of this book. It is a great book, a great resource. And I had lent it to you for a time as well. And I was surprised, actually, by the number of times I went to go in and reference something from it and realize, Chris has it.
And that's the thing. Having had it for months and been able to reference it, I desperately want my own copy of it. But it's amazing. I mean, it's been out of print, since 84 or something like that. Whenever it was last printed, I think it was early 80s when it was last printed. And the cost of it has gone up dramatically. And a lot of the copies that are at the quote unquote more affordable end of the market are often ex libris, so they're marked. They've got stamps and things like that from the libraries they came from, or they're not in particularly good condition. And so it's like, do I really want to buy this book? I mean, it's primarily a reference book for me, so if it's got stamps in it or whatever, it's not the end of the world. But at the same time, do I really want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a book that's not in great condition? This saves me all that trouble. I think the listing that I saw on Amazon was $165 Canadian. So, significantly less in other currencies, which are more valuable. But it's nice to see that this book is going to come out. I'll be curious to see what new information is in there, because typically when his books are reprinted, there's often a little bit of new information, either corrections or sometimes a new foreword written by somebody with some new details in it. So I'll be curious to see what else is there, and hopefully some of the quality of the photographs. Maybe they've they've been able to go back to the original source images, and with better printer technology now, maybe we'll get some better quality images from some of these prints as well.
I would be very surprised if they're able to do that, but it's not beyond the realm of reason.
Yeah. Because I believe Daniels took many of those photos, so it may be that those photos are still part of his collection, and so they may be able to reprint better quality versions of those photos, which would be amazing to see better versions of some of those.
I recall an anecdote he relayed once about the cover for Watches, which is another book he had written. He's very good at just taking those really really simple names. Like,
yes.
You want a book on watches? George Daniels written. You want a book on watchmaking? George Daniels, yeah, he's written it.
Yeah.
The book on watchmaking, the book on watches. But for the cover of Watches, he had, it's got to be 24, or at least a dozen watches on the cover of this book. All of them exceedingly rare, very fine watches. All of them pocket watches. And he set up for this shoot. I believe it was with Cecil Sutton, and they got it all set up. The camera set up, and then they had either just taken the photo or were about to take the photo. This is back in the day when you didn't just have a digital camera.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a trivial matter setting up and taking a photo shoot. But they needed a break for lunch, so they just kind of left where they had been set up and walked out with like literally hundreds of thousands of pounds in the monetary sense of watches just laying on the floor against a blue backdrop, and they go out and grab a bite and smoke a pipe, and then mosey on back in and finish what they were doing.
Yeah. You don't want to trip and fall in that room. It's
no,
it could be an expensive problem.
Kind of reminds me of the rare time I've had an exceedingly expensive piece to work on my bench, and just walking it from my bench to the safe or what have you, just always a little bit of trepidation there, realizing that if I trip with this tray full of parts, or knock it on something, that there goes the entire sum of my house and then some.
Yeah,
with some of these Patek Philippe and Rolex
mistake.
timepieces.
Yeah,
and some of them one of a kind too.
Sure,
like I've had the good fortune of handling some Patek Philippe's with very fine enamel work done on the cases of these pocket watches, and that is literally one of a kind, irreplaceable. Like you don't want to.
No thanks.
Handle that the wrong way. But that's exactly the sort of caliber that these watches were sitting in, and in the art of breguet, like I don't know if there has ever been anyone who has been in the position that Daniels was to handle as many examples of breguet's work as he did in his lifetime.
Mm-hmm. I think the only person today who's sort of on track to be able to say the same kind of thing is somebody like Peter with his The Naked Watchmaker. Now, he's primarily working with modern watches and being able to go into manufacturers and being able to get a good collection of more modern watches together. But he's one of the few people that I can think of who's actually in that same kind of position where he's an experienced watchmaker and he's getting hands-on time with these watches. Now he's obviously working with a larger number of brands and seeing a larger variety of watches, but he's probably one of the few people, maybe some of the people at a couple of the auction houses. Some of the large auction houses are getting access to a large number of watches coming through their studios and being able to see them up close. But yeah, there's a handful of people that are getting this kind of access to this number of watches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that Peter would be able to hold a candle to the number of pieces that.
No,
that
exactly.
handled.
Yeah, I know, I agree, and I think that's why I say that he's the only, he's one of the few people that sort of can approach that, and even then it's not, it's not the same.
Yeah, because Daniels was consulting for an auction house. He was the direct restorer, the specialist that Browns was the family that owned Breguet for a good portion of the 20th century. He was their go-to guy to work on these pieces and restore them and bring them back to good working order. So he handled and worked on all of them.
Yeah, it's a weird situation. Hopefully, I really wish that we would see more of this, like more publishing of, this kind of information. But who's going to do it. I mean, there's, if it's somebody that's being employed by the brand, it's unlikely that they're allowed to, unless the brand decides to publish that information themselves. And in a lot of those cases, those books are hard to find. They're very small numbers, insanely expensive. Like Patek has one that they did, and it's just crazy expensive, brand new. It's nice to see this information getting out there, and it really is the definitive book on Breguet and his clocks and watches, and in technical detail that you're just not going to get anywhere else.
And the price tag on those Patek Philippe books are not without merit. These are very niche products, and the production value on them is very high. For instance, in their Star Caliber 2000 book, they actually have translucent or transparent pages that'll give you a nice breakdown layer by layer of the movement. So it's not just like some run-of-the-mill print job. There's a lot of thought and attention to detail that goes into these books. Speaking from experience, also very good at replacing a book should one be damaged in transit to you. I received a book and that came a little dinged up on one of the edges, and given the princely sum I had paid for it, I did reach out to them, and they had no issue at all but sending out a replacement for it. But they are great resources, and
Sure.
the information in them is information you really aren't going to be able to get anywhere else. And all of this in a roundabout way saying the information in The Art of Breguet is information that you really can't get anywhere else, and it is coming from a first-rate source.
Yes.
It really is a treasure of a book in the world of horology.
Absolutely.
And speaking of, Philippe's in the world of horology, so the kings of high horology, Philippe Dufour made some incredible news since we last recorded an episode together.
He doesn't have to worry about paying for his retirement anymore.
Yes, that's right. Just one of his watches, Watch Zero, of his latest collection of simplicities, is a re-edition, so to speak. It's a 20th anniversary edition of the Simplicity by Philippe Dufour. It's a collection of just 21 pieces, and that's including piece 0, which went up for auction at Phillips and sold for $1.51 million for a time-only watch crafted by a single watchmaker. That is not to say every component of the watch was crafted wholly by Philippe Dufour. He has a select number of artisans that he does work with who do help him with things like the case and the strap and the box and the dial. But as far as the movement goes, that is all his handiwork at play. And the exceptional level to which he finishes his timepieces and the love that he pours into them, I think has certainly been well received by the market of collectors out there. This went for several multiples over the high estimate.
Well, and when you consider that he had another piece that went recently, it was it a 34 millimeter version of a Simplicity that went for 600,000 just a month or so ago. It's nice to see a living watchmaker earning this kind of money off of his pieces while he's still alive, while he's still making them, and he's the one who's making that money. It's not as though this is a collector who bought one of his watches 30 years ago and has sold it for $1.5 million, and the collector is the one who's earned the money off of it. In this case, it's actually the artist. It's the watchmaker himself, and he's benefiting from it, and it's great to see. You see a bit of this with the Only Watch auction, but there the money isn't going to the watchmaker; it's going to the charity, and that's great. And it's nice to see that the industry is raising money like that. But you see these people who are individual watchmakers who have pieces like Recep has had pieces in there, and Kari's had pieces in there, and Journe, and you've got all these people who are selling watches for ridiculous sums of money in these auctions, and they're not really benefiting directly from it. Obviously, they're getting the notoriety from it and whatnot, but they're not directly benefiting financially from it. It's great to see Philippe getting the recognition which he's been getting for years, but B, it's translating into some actual cash. And that is wonderful to see. There's hope for all of us that someday maybe we'll be able to actually, be able to put up pieces at auction brand new. And maybe this will be considered a viable way for us to sell our pieces. This is something that artists in other fields have actually been able to do and have been able to do successfully. But the watch world has been, a little bit more hesitant to do this kind of thing in the past. And I hope that this is the beginning of a trend for watchmakers to be able to release their pieces out into the world and be able to actually get a reasonable price for them.
Mm-hmm. I think it's just Philippe Dufour and Francois Polgeron now who are living watchmakers whose pieces have sold now for more than $1 million US.
Yeah.
I can't think of any others. I mean, I'm sure Voutilainen won't be far behind them, and perhaps Smith. But it is a remarkable testament to his work and, truthfully, to the decades of work that he has poured into the craft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you see the number of collectors that are buying pieces, they're speculating and buying pieces, and they'll throw it in a safe and hold on to it for a decade or whatever, and then sell it for multiples of what they paid for it. And that's fine. That's a totally legitimate way of spending your money and investing your money if that's what you want to do. But at the end of the day, people will talk about the crazy sums that, that these watches will get at auction. And yeah, I don't really, again, it's the investors that are buying those watches that are benefiting from it. Here we're seeing the actual watchmaker, which is great. Love seeing this. Hope we see a lot more of it. And congratulations to Philippe. It's nice to see that's actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that other simplicity that you mentioned that sold earlier this past autumn, or I guess we're still in the autumn. We're covered in snow here. It feels very much like winter, but we are technically still in the autumn. So earlier this autumn, that other simplicity that did sell for $600,000 plus. Philippe didn't see a penny of that. That all went to the collector and the auction house. And to put that into some perspective, the original owner of that watch would have only paid about 60,000 Swiss francs for the piece at the time that they bought it. So that's like a 10x increase in return on investment.
That's great investment. Obviously, that guy was smart in buying the watch and keeping it in the condition that it was in, and speculated. I mean, I guess speculation isn't really the right way of putting it. Anybody who's buying a Dufour, at that time, you knew that the watch was going to go up in value, so that wasn't really much of a speculation. But right place, right time, having the money to be able to do it, that's great. But obviously, Philippe isn't seeing any of that money.
And I've never bought one of Bob Kramer's knives, but as I understand it, this is sort of the approach that he and his assistant have taken to selling his wares. Is they will send out a notice that there will be a piece coming up, and basically you are on a list to participate in the auction for it.
Yeah,
and it goes for whatever it goes for.
Yeah,
when it becomes available.
Yeah, Bob has done this for a number of years now, and you can purchase basically a membership to get in on the auctions. It's it's $5 or something like that. It's not particularly expensive, or maybe a little bit more than that, but it's not onerous. And when the pieces become available, they go up for auction, and you can participate in that auction, and they go for what they go for. And his knives, he's making kitchen knives, and they'll often go for tens of thousands of dollars. And he's one of the few artists I've seen who's been able to do that. Mike Walker, he's participated in the past in Art Knife International, which was an invitation-only knife show. And again, that was set up in a way that where the artists themselves were controlling the prices or controlling the auctions for it. They, single day event with dedicated collectors who were there, and had the money to spend on that kind of stuff. And I know Mike was I think he was the first person to sell a knife at auction for more than $100,000 US. Like he, again, it was, it's that sort of artist controlled environment like that where people have been able to do that. You get painters, you get occasionally, art jewelers and things like that who've been able to do this, but it's sort of working its way out of more of the art field, the high-end art industry. And that's what these watches are. They're high-end art.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they should be treated. We already are in many ways. We're buying and selling them as investments. And, we should be treating the living artists the same way and actually giving them the benefits of it. Philippe shouldn't be doing that work and selling that watch for 60,000 francs, right? There's no reason to. The market is interested enough in his products that they're willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for them. He should be benefiting from that.
Mm-hmm. And I find it interesting that it is only going to be this first watch that is sold at that auction, and that for the rest of the pieces, they've actually designated or laid out that there will only be one piece sold per country.
Yeah.
And he actually has a good friend of his handling all the sales side
Mm-hmm.
of this for him. I think it's really interesting and novel, the way that they're going about this. And I'm interested to see how that in itself plays out. If we hear much of this at all, a lot of these deals are clearly going to be happening behind closed doors. Yeah, it's certainly a new era for watchmakers.
Yeah.
It is an art form. It always has been an art form, but it has now been elevated to art.
Yeah, and we don't know what the prices are of those watches that are going individually. And I think the reason that he wanted to do that was because he didn't want to have 19 watches in Japan and one watch somewhere else in the world. Because that's probably what would have happened. His watches are unbelievably popular in Japan. Out of the 200 odd watches that he did for Simplicity originally, I think more than 150 of them are in Japan. They're like the vast majority of them are in the hands of Japanese collectors. And I think he wanted to avoid having that distribution, whether it's in Japan or Hong Kong or Singapore or wherever it happened to be. He wanted to be able to say that, okay, the people around the world had the option to be able to get this, because there really are only 20 of them available. For those of us who are in Canada, if you have the money, maybe you're going to be on a list of a half a dozen people who are interested and have the money to buy it.
I would actually be genuinely surprised if it is only half a dozen. I imagine it is.
It might be more than that. Yeah, it may be more than that. And I don't even know if Canada is one of the countries on the list. It may not be. Right? I don't know that we're necessarily on the radar as a great watch collecting nation. But obviously, America. There's going to be one for that. There's going to be one for Japan. There's going to be one for Hong Kong. So I'm curious to see if we ever hear any details about that. I don't know that we ever will, because it's all going to be sort of private sales, but it'll be interesting to see if we hear any details about it.
Well, I do know of a small handful of collectors from Canada who have thrown their name in the hat.
Okay.
It's basically just a Gmail address, actually, that you're supposed to write to, just to get your name in the running for one of the remaining 20 pieces. Actually, remaining 19 now, because Dufour is actually keeping one for himself.
Oh, good for him. And a few bits of information about other podcasts and things that are going on right now. In the past, we've talked about the Time for a Pint virtual get-togethers, which were being hosted by Chris Mann and Matt, the watch nerd. We were on an episode back in the summer. There have been a few episodes of it published recently, the last couple of weekends of November. Chris and Matt have already hosted 2 of them, and I think Chris was saying that there are at least 2 more being published by the end of the year. And I think he has plans for a few more in the new year as well. If you were interested in the virtual get-togethers and you wanted to actually participate in them, then those are going on. Go to the Time for a Pint website and check them out. They're certainly worth watching and getting in on the live chats and the live question and answer as well. That's kind of nice. So those are starting to happen again. And then another person who we've talked about in the past, Seth Kennedy. He's an antiquarian horologist out of London. He's going to be in conversation with a Canadian who has been doing interviews about the journeys that artists have been on and the kind of work that they're doing. And that's coming up on December 9th, which is a Wednesday. And that's available as a Zoom event. Anybody can get into it. You don't have to be a member of anything or pay for anything. It's a free event. So that's worth checking out. We'll put a link in the show notes to that as well.
Yeah, certainly. Those are all great things to check out. And it is a treat to have Time for a Pint virtual get-togethers back up and running again. And if you have missed out on any of the past ones, they are all available to stream on YouTube as well. So we'll be sure to link up to their YouTube channel in the show notes as well.
Mm-hmm.
as this episode drops, Cyber Monday will have just passed, and we now have some off-hours merch available for sale.
Merch.
And so if you fancy getting yourself an off-hours t-shirt or getting one of our little off-hours gears with the play symbol in it, now is as good a time as ever, because the service that we are using for the merch, they are actually having their Black Friday, Cyber Monday hoopla going on. So the t-shirts are usually $20, but they're down to $12, and they will remain at that price for the basic tee until December the 7th at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So that's our time here. So it'll be December 7th at 4 p.m. GMT. That sale will have ended. So if you're listening to this and that time has not yet passed, and you fancy getting yourself a t-shirt or some stickers or a hoodie, have at it and make use of that lowest price that is likely to be on there.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.